Good evening and welcome to your Friday evening live stream. This is SPTV live from the UK with me, Apostate Alex, and my wonderful guest for the evening, Danielle Chamberlin. Welcome.
Hello, everyone.
How are you doing, Danielle? Thank you for joining.
Really well, thanks. Yeah, really good. Thank you.
I'm really excited to talk to you this evening because when I started my channel, I didn't really know what I was doing. I was like, let's talk about Scientology, my experience, and I wanted to give other people a platform to do the same. And there's lots of stories about what happens in Scientology in America, in the Sea Org, at Flag, and in LA. And I kind of really wanted to give a voice to people who work at the city level orgs, like myself at London, for example, and show that what goes on doesn't just happen over there. It happens everywhere at every level. And I didn't really know where I was going with it, but over time, more and more people have contacted me, like yourself, saying, hey, I have a UK Scientology experience. And it's just so lovely to see people come through the woodworks and start talking about what happened to them. And so, yeah, thank you for reaching out. And I'm really excited to share your story. I know you've been on Mark Fisher and Janice Gillen Grady's channel. I watched that earlier today. So, yeah, was that the first time you'd spoken out about your experience, or have you done stuff in the past?
No, it is. I mean, I've said things privately to friends, obviously.
Yes.
But I've pretty much kept it a secret. It wasn't something that was, people didn't have a sort of real reality about what it was. And it just didn't fit into my work life, etc., etc. But I think the motivation now for me speaking out is really that it's time that the truth was told. I think Scientology today seems to be living in the dark ages. They have a creed which talks about inalienable rights for, everything except gender. They're against gay people. They're against homosexual people. They're against, so many different genders. And there's abuse, and that needs to be talked about. I often hear the story, well, they're not doing that anymore. Well, that doesn't let them off the hook. And it has to be addressed. And I was abused, and I want my truth to be told.
I think that's so important as well. It's one thing to go through it. It's another thing to come to terms with it. And then it's a whole nother ball game when someone is brave enough to stand up and speak about it and say, hey, this happened to me. And it doesn't matter whether it happened yesterday or whether it happened 50 years ago. It's still something that happened and needs to be talked about. And I think particularly in the UK, because we're very conservative with a small c and very, just stiff upper lip, let's just get on with it and keep ourselves to ourselves. People don't really talk about what happened to them in Scientology and just kind of move on with their life. And it's completely fine if people want to do that, right? But if someone does have the courage to speak out, I think it's important, because I've already had many people message me going, just hearing a British voice explaining Scientology and talking about what happened to them has made me realize I'm not alone. I'm not the only person that this happened to or this happened to. And it gives people the ability to confront what happened to them. And I'm hoping by bringing more British people on, that's what we can do.
And share, it's helping get rid of the burden. It's, definitely.
Absolutely. So should we start off with a little bit of background into who you are? I mean, I know you've told your story quite in depth on Mark and Janice's channel, which is a great interview, guys. If you haven't watched it already, go and check it out on our Scientology Stories Peeling the Onion. Talk about your story in an in-depth interview. But just in a nutshell, for people who maybe haven't watched that, how did you get into Scientology? What did you do while you were there? And when did you come out of Scientology?
Okay, so very briefly, I was born in what was old Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. And at the age of I think I was about 3 or 4, went down to South Africa. And my mother got involved with Scientology through a mission in Johannesburg. And so at age 6, I was going in as a member of the public every weekend with my family to do training routines and the communication course, etc. So really, from the age of 6 until I finally left when I was 21, that's how long I was in Scientology, and then later on in the Sea Org. Coming to England just after my parents split up, because my father was found to have been a plant or a spy, if you like. for the mental health organization. And I've since discovered, since my interview with Janice, that it was for BOSS, the Secret Service Agency in Johannesburg. So
Wow.
it was just of them that they got, because it was like a shore story, if you like. The mental health organization got my father put into Scientology to feed back. That ultimately resulted in my parents splitting up. And then I came to England with my mother and my two other siblings to England, and we joined the Sea Org. That was in July 1973. And I was just turning 12 that year. And just before my 12th birthday, I was flown to Lisbon to join the Flagship Apollo to train to be a Commodore's messenger. You can hear on my video that didn't work out. I was there for about a year, ultimately being locked up by LRH, L. Ron Hubbard, in the chain locker of the ship for 3 days and 3 nights, and being offloaded. I had to petition for permission to join my mother, and I was just still 12 years old. Absolutely bloody insane. And yes, child trafficking. It was child abuse. It was child trafficking. It was effectively kidnapping, holding me against my will. Abysmal and really disgusting behavior on the part of the Scientology group.
And these are things that you don't realize at the time. Like when I was in Scientology, I signed my Sea Org contract. I was under the age of 18. I was like, yeah, let's join the Sea Org. I want to dedicate my life to this. And I was on a project, prepare to go arrive at Flag. And I was excited. This was cool. Like the guys in their uniforms, like I want to look like that. I want to be on a mission, but you don't realize if I had arrived at Flag, like the plan was meant to be, that would have been child trafficking, and that's what would have happened. But you don't think in the moment that that's what is happening to you. And Scientology has such a way of disassociating yourself and your mind with like actually what's going on in reality. What was that like for you? Like how long did it take you to realize the reality of what happened to you, or did you kind of know at the time?
I didn't really know at the time, because we were so indoctrinated to believe that we were ultimately going to be clearing the planet, which is just bull. I just wish the people in Scientology today could look outside and just see how much clearing they're actually doing, So really, because I was so indoctrinated, I became even more so because I was sent to Flag for training. And I also worked for the Guardian's office for a while. And it's just, it's just layers and layers of indoctrination. And it, like Janice and Mark say, peeling the onion, you have to peel it to get to the ultimate truth. And it weighs heavy on you, and you don't realize, actually, you become a robot. I really do think they're the ultimate trainers of robots. They're brilliant at it. They turn you into a non-human. You're not allowed to have human emotion and reaction. Imagine you're not allowed to cry, for heaven's sake. You get into trouble for crying. It's just barbaric, actually.
Yeah.
It turns you into a non-human. And so I basically was the last to leave. My mother had had a stroke at age 42, and they kicked her out. And she'd been working till 3 o'clock every morning for 3 weeks in the run-up to having had her stroke. And the Scientologist had gone to the hospital before she'd had any intervention and took her out of hospital. And so, when you have a stroke, you need immediate treatment. And she didn't get it. And they sent her back to Stonelands for touch assists, which is one of these assists that they have in to help you heal in Scientology.
It's a bit like Reiki, right? It's kind of, using it's all about energy flows and, directing your attention to places. It's not actually like a medical thing that can help someone recover from any sort of illness. It's a mind thing.
No, exactly. And my sister, a 14-year-old on her own, she was babysitting all the children in the house while adults went to work at night, and caring for my mother. And Anna Rutherford was a lovely lady who was there, and she was a nurse. And they asked Anna, my sister asked Anna, could you take a look at Mum? And she said, no, we've got to get a doctor. And they sent her to hospital again. That was it. And Scientology wiped their hands of her. She was given no support whatsoever, and she'd given her life to them. It was just disgusting. And that was my wake-up call. I was on the RPF at Stonelands at this stage. I had been LRH Com at Follow UK, and in 1982, a lot of people left, and the CMO were getting more powerful, if you like, and putting in ethics, and it became quite horrible. And I'm actually quite glad I left when I did, because it sounds like things got a lot worse after I left. I think the no television was just coming in as I was leaving, no newspapers, and drip, drip, drip. And we've got complete control of you,
Absolutely.
So quite insidious.
Let's delve into that in a second. I think I want to just take a step back first, because one thing that you said earlier about the ages you were in, from the age of 6, joining the Sea Org at the age of 12, and then leaving when you're 21. I was a similar age when I joined Scientology. I was a teenager. And one of the things that my therapist once said to me was, if you came up to me and said you joined Scientology as an adult and you were in for a couple of years and left, it wouldn't have been as much of a problem as if you were the age that you were, because she explained that your mind is still developing until you're in your early 20s. And what Scientology does is it actually programs your brain to think in certain ways, because your brain is still developing its neural pathways. So things like suppressing emotions, like you were mentioning earlier in the training routines, it is literally wiring your brain to function in a certain way. So when you come out of Scientology, it's a lot harder to then figure out and undo that work and retrain your brain to think in a different way. And that's one thing I really want to highlight with my channel and talking to people, is that the TRs, the training routines, and the policy of Scientology itself, like aside from the organization and the abuse and this other stuff that we'll talk about shortly, but the actual Scientology in and of itself is damaging when applied in the way that it is. Right?
Absolutely. And it suppresses your childhood. You don't get to experience what childhood is. There are huge gaps in my knowledge. When I left, I didn't know anything about music scene, for example. I hadn't been to plays. I hadn't, there was so much that was not around, that forms who one becomes and who, how you learn. I remember an incident once when I was at Flag. I was at the Flag Land Base in Clearwater in Florida, and this little girl came. I went into the lift, and they call them elevators, don't they, in the States? And she said, "You hold," like looking at me in the eyes, pointing at me. And she was only, I think she was about 5 or something. And she said to me, "You hold that elevator right there," and like really ordering me. Wow. And this was LRH's granddaughter, Roanne.
Oh gosh.
Diana's little daughter. And she had this, like, already at that age, she had this persona of like,
that tone 40 intention,
total.
Yeah,
it's not good.
No, because think about what that does to you, like where that leads you and what that makes someone become. As an adult, if you've grown up in an environment where you're bossing people around, they're following what you do, and you're taught to be very direct and clear and getting what you want, I think we're all aware of the sort of effect that will have on someone later on in life.
It reminds me of the Stasi.
Well said. Exactly.
Absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit about your experience then, because you mentioned a lot of Scientology lingo that I want to clarify for the non-Scientology people watching. So you talked about the CMO, that's the Commodore's Messengers organization, which is the people effectively when Oren Hubbard was on the ship. Or you might be better explaining, actually, because you were there, what the CMO was, and then I can explain what it is now.
Okay, well, the Commodore's Commodore's Messengers were young children who literally ran messages for L. Ron Hubbard. So, and they would verbatim. So he would tell them, you know, I don't know, if he wanted to ask someone for a folder, they could go down and they can get the folder. But he might also say, you know, why hasn't this been done? And they would go down and they'd have to say, why hasn't this been done? And then they'd be given a response and they'd have to verbatim run that back up to him to say why. And that's how he sort of communicated to people all around the ship and how he got things done. They wore uniform, they were on watch. So because he styled himself as a so-called Commodore, because he had about 3 or 4 vessels, everything was done a bit like a navy. So you had, you know, chief petty officers, warrant officers, ethics officers, but you also had these Commodore's messengers. And they really ruled the roost on the ship. They were held in quite high esteem by other people on the ship. And if they said something, it went, you know, you had to listen to them. I found them quite a cliquey group. As I said to Janice in my interview, you were either in or out, and I definitely wasn't an innie, you know, I was out. But I mean, I was ironing their uniforms and things like this. And this gives them a status, you know, that they then become this person who is in control of stuff, you know. Yeah, not good.
And these people, even though L. Ron Hubbard has passed away, Scientology is still ongoing and the Commodore's messages still exist. Like, I will never forget the time I first went to St. Hill, and I was there with a friend of mine. I was staying at her house and we went to St. Hill. I sat there kind of in the refectory area and she needed to go off and do something, so she was like, I'll just wait here. And then I saw this guy literally like jogging down the stairs in a full naval uniform, and I was like, he looks cool, like what's this guy doing? And she explained, she was like, oh, that's one of the messengers. And I was like, what on earth is that? And she was explained the story that you just explained. They said, well, now they're there to kind of preserve and protect the technology, but also they're the ones that are keeping it true to L. Ron Hubbard. So they are sending important messages between chairman of the board, David Miscavige, and the higher up, like upper management. And the reason they run everywhere and they're in high, you know, full naval regalia is because they're doing important work and it's urgent work. So if you see one of them, you have to like freeze, you salute them, you know, because we were on staff at the time, and you kind of, you know, don't get in their way because they are the most important people in the room. So they're still around. That's very much how they still operate today, even though they don't have the Apollo or they don't have LRH himself.
Yeah, it wasn't as bad as that when I was there.
Which is mad because you were there with L. Ron Hubbard himself.
Yeah, but I didn't work for him. You see, I never made it. I never graduated as a Commodore's messenger. Thank heavens. You know,
why not? What happened? Because you arrived at the ship, right? And then you
and I did, from day one, I wanted to go back to my mother. I was on my own. I mean, it's insane. What parent today would even consider sending their 11, 12-year-old child to somewhere where you didn't even know geographically? My parents were not allowed, my mother was not allowed to know where I was because Ron was on the ship and he was persona non grata. So in effect, he was in hiding from the IRS, from the, people in England. So it's insane, just insane.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
And it really does throw that into question of, when you're in Scientology, you think Scientology is the most effective way of helping the most amount of people on the planet. So in one sense, I understand how a parent could think, if they're brainwashed and under the control of Scientology themselves, how they could think this is the best thing for their child is to go and work for the man who created it all, and or on it, my child's going to be on a really important mission and they're going to help the planet and all of this. And I can see that aspect, but I really don't understand how, even if that's the way you are thinking, how you could still think it's okay to send your 11-year-old child on a plane on their own with no one to pick them up, not know where they are, and have no communication with them. You can still be doing an important thing and care for your child, and know that information at least, right? I just don't get how any parent could think that that's the right thing to do.
No, and I wasn't the only one. There were other children on the ship without adults. Janice was surprised. She thought that, the children who got sent to the ship ought to have had their parents with them, but I really had nobody. And so from day one, I was sobbing on my bunk. They'd put me on this bunk in a crowded dormitory on the ship, and they take your passports. You know, when you live on a ship, they take your passports anyway. And I said I wanted to go back and join my mother again. And they said, no, you can't. And they call it blowing when you leave in Scientology. No, you can't blow. And so I had to become, I did what they call the Estates Project Force. So I joined what they call the EPF, Estates Project Force, where you know, scrub the decks and you paint the cabins and you do cleaning and all that sort of thing. So once I finished that, I ended up in the galley as a steward and, you know, washing dishes. We had to rinse all our lettuce leaves in gentian violet to kill off any bugs. Every single leaf, and just preparing salads and what have you. But then I just decided, you know, I kept asking, I want to go back to join my mother. And I wrote letters, but if you make any reference to where you are, all your letters are read and everything's redacted. So any reference to where you, like we were in Tenerife and Las Palmas and Setúbal and, you know, etc., that would be crossed out. But still nothing. And so I decided the only way to get off this ship is to be as naughty as I possibly could. So I was assigned to work with what they call the ethics officer or the master at arms, who's in charge of justice and behavior on the ship, etc. And the first task was to file a huge backlog of knowledge reports that they write. Everybody writes knowledge reports in Scientology. There are no secrets between anybody, you know. And they write knowledge reports.
This is really, really intensely impressed on every Scientologist. Like even a husband and wife couple will write knowledge reports on each other because you think that Scientology is the only way of helping that person. So if you know that your spouse has done something unethical, you write the report on them, not to get them in trouble, but because you think the church can help them correct their ways so that they don't mess up and they become more ethical and live a better life. So you think you're helping them, but in actual fact, you're not. But when Danielle here says that you write knowledge reports on everyone and everything, it's literally, she's not lying. Like it is everyone and everything.
Yeah. And this backlog, I don't know how tall I was, but it came up to my waist. It was a big backlog and I could not be asked filing them. I just couldn't. And so I shredded them. I shredded them all. Well, you can imagine how much trouble I got in. And I actually didn't realize the significance of what I'd done until I was older. But I'm not doing that. So I shredded them all.
I said this to you on the phone the other day, and I still stand by it. Like I think you must have inadvertently helped a lot of people in doing that, because who knows what was contained in those reports that were never filed because they were lost. You probably helped a lot of people and didn't even know it.
Honestly, it's just crazy. And then it was around that time that Ken Urquhart, who worked for LRH, devised...
Amy Scobie's in the chat. She's just said, hooray, you shredded the ethics filings. Way to go.
Hi, Amy.
Hi, Amy. How are you doing? Thanks for joining us.
It's the same as there was an amnesty at St. Hill once, and my husband and Otto Roos went and got their ethics files and went and burnt them. And someone said to him, what are you doing? You can't do that. I said, well, there was an amnesty. No, you know, you're supposed to put a piece of paper there and say, this is nothing, you know, disregard this from this point on.
Because in Scientology, the policy is never remove, destroy, or get rid of anything. Everything is written down and recorded, and you are never allowed to get rid of it. It's everything that you ever do in Scientology is written down, reported on, held in your ethics file or your pre-clear folder, and it's kept there for like eternity, right? When I was at London Org, we had ethics files and pre-clear folders that dated back to the 80s from people who only spent a couple of months in Scientology and then you know haven't been in a Scientology building in 30-40 years. We still had their ethics file. It's against policy to delete or remove anything.
It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. So and then Ken Urquhart devised the Rehabilitation Project Force when I was on the Apollo, and we had to wear black armbands and black boiler suits. We weren't allowed to talk to the other members of the crew unless we were spoken to first. We had to run around doing as we said, mess work all day. So we were scrubbing decks, cleaning, painting, you know, lots of physical work all day. And then at night we had to study. And then but we couldn't eat until the crew had eaten. And sometimes there wasn't any food left. You know, it was quite horrible. And then we were training at night, and still things were not getting better. And eventually I hit what's called the Rehabilitations Project Force, so RPF's RPF. That was devised.
Wow.
Because I wasn't playing ball. I did not want to stay. So I just wanted to go back to my family, which any normal child would want, you know. So Ron Hubbard, L. Ron Hubbard, I call him L. Con Hubbard.
I like that.
He had me locked up in the chain locker of the ship for 3 days and 3 nights with another girl. And then after 3 days and 3 nights, sounds like something out of the Bible, doesn't it?
It does. It does.
I was then locked up in the laundry room for a couple of days, and then escorted back to the UK by somebody called Bill Churchill. Finally got back with my mother again. And from there, things started to get a little bit. I was a bit naughty for a little bit longer, but not much longer. And then I was able to go to school again and things like that. But always coming home from school, going straight into receptionist or letter regging, where you write letters to lots of people from their central files. So woe betide anybody who buys a book once and whose address stays on their files forever, because you will be inundated with literature and letters and books.
I spoke to a friend of mine just the other day who I sold a book to when I was on staff in 2011, so 12 years ago.
Wow.
And he mentioned that he still to this day receives flyers and letters and stuff through the door. And he bought the book, and he's never been into a church. He's never contacted them. He's never replied. And he said he still gets bombarded with mailing stuff in the mail from Scientology. If Scientology have your data, they will be sending you stuff. And even if you write to them saying, please stop, they won't. You have to make it really, really clear that you don't want them to send
give
you
them
it.
a fake address.
Yeah, exactly.
It's ridiculous. Anyway, so I did that for a while. And then I was put to work working for the Assistant Guardian UK, who was a lady called Judy Tampion, an Australian lady. And she was working for Jane Kember. And she had a lady as her secretary called Kathy Sproul. I think Kathy might have joined OSA, I'm not sure. And I worked with them for a while. And then I was doing my A-levels at school, and John Chadder, working for Jane Kember, came and got me out of school and said, you can't do your A-levels, you can't finish your education, Scientology is much more important, and pulled me out, yanked me out. My mother never said anything.
What year would this have been, Danielle?
78.
Roughly? So to give people context, when I was doing my A-levels, or I just finished school in 2011 and was just starting my A-levels, I had a very similar experience. My parents weren't Scientologists. They wanted me to go to sixth form and university. And I'd like to, but I wasn't that fussed. I was on staff, and, we devised a plan on how to handle my family and get them to be okay with me being on staff and not doing my A-levels. And what you just said about them coming to yank you out of school and saying you can't do your A-levels, that's how I was treated. And that was 30, 40 years later. And it's like, no, this is the way they operate. They think they are better than education. Education is not necessary. It's not important. The only thing that matters is clearing the planet. And getting the tech out there and disseminating Scientology.
Yeah. And getting, warped tech out there, for heaven's sake. Hail Xenu.
Yeah, I know, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about your time? Because you mentioned that you were LRH Com UK. So for those of you watching, that's L. Ron Hubbard's communicator for the UK. And you're responsible for ensuring L. Ron Hubbard's words and policies are followed like to the T, right, throughout the whole UK,
until someone comes along and tells you, no, you can't do it that way, which is ultimately what happened. So A-levels, then I was sent to Follow UK, the Flag Office Liaison Office in the UK, was moved from their headquarters at St Hill in East Grinstead in West Sussex to a place, an old nunnery, which then became a school, which then became the headquarters of Follow UK. And that was at St Mary's in Rottingdean near Brighton. And we had just moved there, and I was with Judy Tampion, still working for her, and was sent to the Flag land base at Clearwater in Florida to do what they call the Org Executive Course, or the Flag Executive Briefing Course. There was a big push to train
right?
executives up, and so that was in 1980-81, just after my mum had had her stroke. So that was hard for me because, again, trigger point really, leaving my mother, who had had her stroke. So that was difficult for me. But once I got into the swing of it, I actually quite liked being there. Being a student was easy. We weren't under pressure like Sea Org members are under pressure. We didn't have to run everywhere, and we didn't have to worry about 2:00 Thursday when, you know, all the statistics come in and you've got to talk about what money you've made for the week, etc. So I quite enjoyed that. And when I came back as, well, first of all, I went on a mission to St. Louis. Where did I go?
You went to Happy, right? Up in Scotland.
Oh, no, that was before. I'm sorry. I went to Happy before. But after, before I flew back to England as LRH Come UK, I went on a mission to 3 different orgs, St. Louis, Columbus, and Cincinnati.
Oh, gosh. I didn't know that. Okay.
Oh,
what were you doing?
St. Louis, Columbus, and one other one. It was a fact-finding mission, and I went with a lady who came from London Org, actually, Carol Caulfield. And she and I went on a fact-finding mission to these 3 orgs, and that wasn't long. And I mean, it was literally probably a week, if that. And then I flew back to the UK as LRH Come UK. And it was going really well initially, and then the CMOs started to come in. The Commodore's Messenger org started to be built up, and they got rid of a lot of executives, and there was this mass fallout where people just left, hook, line, and sinker. And there was a very high-profile member of the public who had to have what they called a committee of evidence. And I was adamant that it be done per policy, which is how I'd been trained. And I was told that I was siding with him because he was a suppressive person, and I was put on the RPF.
So we've heard about the RPF. You know, you told your story of being on the ship and being in the RPF there. I think people watching may be more familiar with the stories of the Hole and the RPF over in America. And the RPF, just to recap, is basically a punishment system in Scientology, and it's been described as a hard labor prison camp. It's where you're forced to do hard manual labor and do confessionals and all of this until you realize what you've done wrong and make amends, and someone decides that you have rehabilitated. And I think that story has been told a lot. You know, Mike Rinder was in the Hole, Claire Headley, all of the, you know, top executives that we hear speaking out on YouTube now, pretty much all of them have had an experience on the RPF. But what I don't think has been told before is that happens here in the UK as well. And it happened to you. Like, what on earth, why were you put on the RPF, and what did that entail for you?
Okay, so the reason I was put on is because they said I was siding with the suppressive person. But then we were put in dormitories at Stonelands. So Stonelands with the big manor house in West Hoathly in West Sussex.
I can bring up some pictures of Stonelands, actually, if you like, if you want to give some visuals. So Stonelands is also where Claire Headley from Blown for Good was. I think she lived or worked here for a while. It's I'm just opening it up here. So it was recently sold. So these are some pictures from the sales brochure that show what it's like nowadays. But it's this lovely old manor.
I mean, we lived in the whole house. It's now been converted into, these are luxury apartments now. So it's been split up into very expensive luxury apartments. It was, I mean, it was tired and old when we lived there. that used to be the Cronin's bedroom, what you're looking at now.
The Cronins are they're still in Scientology. That's the name I
they?
recognize. Yeah, the Cronins for sure.
So they lived there. That used to be their bedroom. Yeah, you see the lovely wood paneling.
Yes.
It didn't look anything like this then. We had no carpeting, we had no curtains. We had storage heaters, nighttime storage heaters, which had bricks in them, which were wholly ineffective, really, because the wind used to howl through the single pane glass. I remember being in bed in the dormitory, and it was winter, and the ice was forming on the inside of the windows, not outside. My sister and I had sort of snowball fights when we had mumps once, just in the dormitory. I mean, it was freezing. And you used to sort of get dressed under the bedclothes because it was so bloody cold.
And what was the reason they didn't put in things like heating or give you good clothes to wear that so you wouldn't be so, why didn't they refurbish? Because it's not like Scientology was lacking in money in those days. Scientology was booming during that period of
where
time.
did the money go? It didn't go to Sea Org members ever.
Exactly.
It went up.
Exactly.
Then, we were in tatters, our clothing. I mean, we honestly, in those days, on Saturday mornings, we go to town to jumble sales to get secondhand clothing. We just didn't, we were not looked after. And if the statistics were down on a Thursday, we had beans and rice all week to eat. And that wasn't even on the RPF. That was just normal, everyday staff members in the Sea Org. We ate beans and rice, it was dreadful, really. Deprived. We were poor,
and there's no reason why you should have or had to live like that when there was enough money, and still is in Scientology enough money to pay everyone a minimum wage to have a reasonable, comfortable existence and still have plenty of money in the bank. There's no reason why Scientology can't or don't provide this. It's not because they can't afford it. It's because all the money goes up lines. And back then it went to L. Ron Hubbard. Now it goes up to international management, and who knows what happens to it after that point. But it's policy to treat people in this way. And the policy says you cannot change what L. Ron Hubbard wrote. You can't change policy. So unfortunately, Scientology isn't ever going to change. It was like this in the 70s. It's like that now. They have enough money. They're not going to spend it on staff welfare.
No, and I often think, just imagine how more productive and happy staff would be if they were treated properly.
Exactly.
None of these SPTV stations would probably be up and running if that were the case. But,
Precisely.
like any despot, Miscavige gets it all, doesn't he? He gets the best of everything. And the staff, his minions, I'm sure he calls them, that Jane Kember used to say, well, how are the boys in blue? It's very interesting to me that people like Jane Kember, Herbie Parkhouse, David Gaiman, they used to sort of launch the rule of law for everybody, but they never were in the Sea Org because they knew better, didn't they?
David and Sheila Gaiman are huge parts of Scientology's history in the UK. Sheila Gaiman there's a video, I don't know if you're aware of this, on David Miscavige's website.
No.
Sheila Gaiman has a video where she's glowing about how wonderful Dave Miscavige is and how amazing he has been to her and her family, and how he's taken Scientology to a new era, a new level of existence. She's donated personally millions to Scientology. Her business, G&G Vitamins, is very much still alive and kicking and supplies all the vitamins to all of the orgs in the UK. And she is at every single event. She has personally donated over £250,000 to open the Birmingham Ideal org, which was opened a few years ago. I've had reports that she's heavily involved in Manchester and Sunderland and getting those orgs open, and has donated a lot of money. These people are hugely important, but they're not in the Sea Org. Like you mentioned.
Well, strangely enough, when I was on the RPF, Claire and Sheila were on the RPF with me. I think Neil was as well briefly. But Claire, Sheila and I, we were building the castle, the new wing of the castle. We were laying down the foundation stones. Wow. Claire was riding the dump truck, you know. Yeah, and Sheila was in our dorm. And basically, after because of mum's stroke and everything, and I said, that's it, I've had enough. So I was on the RPF in the UK, and you have to write what's called a completed staff work, a CSW, to ask permission. So you have to write down what the situation is, and just how it might impact Scientology if you didn't get it sorted and you asking to go or whatever. So I put in this completed staff work and asked if I invented the fact that I had some credit card debts which might bring poor public relations to bear upon Scientology. And I didn't have any, but it gave me some breathing space. It gave me 3 weeks or so to get settled. I moved in with my sister and brother-in-law. And after about 3 weeks, Simon Wackley came knocking on the door, trying to get me to come back in again. And I didn't and wouldn't. But David Gaiman had been declared a suppressive person because of everything that had kicked off with Jane and Mo Budlong and Mary Sue, etc. And when they had raided the IRS buildings and ended up going to prison. And David was doing what's called his A to E, where he's got to try and get back in good standing again. And he needed somebody to do his housework and to be a secretary. And so he asked me if I would do it. And I thought, sure, why not? And he taught me to write my first check. I'd never written a check before, knew nothing about managing money at all.
And that's an important skill to have in Scientology. You certainly need to know how to write checks.
And I quite enjoyed that, and we were getting on really well. And his whole family were not allowed to be in touch with him really because he'd been declared, but Sheila could come and see him and talk to him about doing his A to E. And I was standing at the kitchen sink one day doing some washing up, and she walked in and hit the roof and kicked me out the house. And I never heard from him again after that. He didn't apologize or anything. And then a couple of weeks later, Sheila contacted me and asked me to come for coffee. And I thought she was going to apologize, try and learn what was going on. No, she was just trying to get me to come back in again. And so I never looked back after that. I thought, there's no way that I'm going to be doing this. There were other things that I will talk about at some point in the future in more detail, probably in writing, because you can't talk about it verbally. But I was abused when I was 14 quite badly. And so that also goes down as one of the things where I was blamed for it, not the perpetrator of the abuse, because they do that in Scientology. If you have done something, if you've had something happen to you, it's because of something you've pulled into yourself and it's your fault.
And the justification is that you're a spiritual being with more power, control, and ability than you could ever imagine. So you subconsciously are responsible for everything that happens to you. So if this horrible thing has happened to you, well, ultimately, we're not denying that it happened, but ultimately it's your fault because you put yourself in the situation, in the environment where that could happen to you. And that's it's victim blaming. It's the most awful, atrocious way to treat someone who's been the victim of abuse or anything. And that's something that is very true to Scientology's belief. When you say it like I did, it kind of, you can understand how that mindset comes about of like, you're being responsible. But when you take it to the extreme, it becomes really harmful. And that's a horrible thing and a horrible way to treat someone.
Yeah, it's true. And also I've been looking up whether or not the statute of limitations doesn't apply in certain situations in the UK. I believe it does in America, doesn't it? But not over here.
In the UK,
there's one clause in the UK though, and it's the age group that I was in. So I'd like to get clarification on that. But other than that, yeah, it'd be interesting to see how many others come forward with similar stories.
I think there's so much scope for that as well, of support groups and hearing people's stories. And I've spoken to a lot of people who were in Scientology back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and they've kind of moved on with their life and they're not thinking about speaking out or protesting or anything like this, but just hearing stories makes them think, oh, hold on, I'm not alone. And I think it's totally okay to go about your life and you don't have to attack Scientology. But if you have been the victim of abuse or something has happened to you in the past, even if it was a long time ago, it is still something that happened to you, and you should report it to your authorities where it's appropriate, because if we can build up a picture that shows how this organization is actually operating and has done for years, for decades, then it becomes really clear to law enforcement what Scientology really is. And if there's one or two stories here and there, they might look at it and go, okay, maybe those are, every organization has good and bad bits. But if we can show there is a trend of this stuff happening all over the world, in every level of the organization, then it's clearly an effect of Scientology itself, not just, one or two people who've done wrong things.
Yeah, and it's so important to get the message across that don't allow your kids to get involved in this organization. It's dangerous. For years, I just sat and I got on with my life. But now that other people are speaking out, we have to speak out. We owe it to the children of the future to speak out. We really, really do. And if I can play any part in, exposing the abuses, then I think it's got to be done. I really do.
Absolutely. Do you want to talk a little bit about the RPF more? You mentioned it earlier, but what sort of things were you doing on the RPF apart from laying the foundations for the East Wing and so on?
Well,
what other things were you made to do?
I actually quite enjoyed the RPF, believe it or not, at St. Hill compared to the one on the ship,
right?
Because it wasn't as harsh. And we were doing physical work during the day, but it was things like planting peas, sweeping driveways, cleaning toilets. If it's one thing you learn in Scientology, in the Sea Org, it's how to clean.
Oh, absolutely. And I think also, I don't want to gloss over this, right, is that doesn't sound too terrible. But when you think of it, no, as a Sea Org member, you are dedicating your life to Scientology. So you're waking up at 8:30 in the morning and starting work and working until 10 and 11 at night.
Yeah.
With no breaks or maybe a small break.
No, and you're not allowed time off or anything
not
like that.
Not allowed time off, and it's 7 days a week. So even something as menial as cleaning toilets, imagine doing that for hours and hours and hours all day, every day. Then it suddenly becomes really not a nice thing to be doing.
And I think the reason I say I quite enjoyed it is not because it was the RPF itself I was enjoying. It was the fact that I was away from the stresses and the pressures of the abuses that were going on with the executives behind the scenes, And so it was, I think that's what I enjoyed, is just being away from that.
An escape.
Yeah. And I'd been engaged to a guy at the time, and we were due to get married, and I was on the RPF, and I had to petition to be allowed to go to get married, and I was told, no, you can't. So we had to cancel the wedding.
Why were you told that you couldn't? But just because you were in trouble?
Because I was on the RPF, yeah. But I mean, in hindsight, I dodged a bullet, but it doesn't matter. That the point was that I wasn't allowed to go.
I think Mrs. J actually has said something here really pertinent in the chat. Currently, there are less than 2,500 Scientologists here in the UK. That's true. And I think this is one question I get a lot is, there's not many Scientologists here. It's like, yeah, but it almost doesn't matter, because that doesn't mean it's not significant. And it doesn't mean it's not important, because there aren't many Scientologists, but the Scientologists that there are have a lot of money, like hundreds of millions of dollars. The church turns over something like 30 or 40 million pounds a year in the UK alone. And also, yes, it's only 2,500 people, but those 2,500 people are subject to the treatment that you, Danielle, were just explaining. I don't care if it's one person that's treated like that. That is a story that needs to be told and that needs to be prevented and stopped.
Yeah. And I don't have a problem with anybody wanting to follow whomsoever they wish, wherever they wish, and do what, it's free will, isn't it? But what I do have a problem with is the abuses and the indoctrination and the hiding of the truth from people. And you have children now who are second and third generation in Scientology who don't know what it's like to live in the outside world. They are indoctrinated against it. They're told, they call it it stands for well, orderly gentlemen, but they're told that it's the woke world. And they don't agree with people being homosexual. Imagine if you're gay in Scientology and you're not allowed to be. I mean, everything is restricted and it's turning you into a robot. And these kids, they need to be told that to have the courage, we are here for you. If you need to leave, you want to leave, the Aftermath Foundation is here. We will help you, you know.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
whether it's one person or 2,000, 25,000 people, Alex, it doesn't matter. What matters is that these people know that they can come to us for help if they need it.
Absolutely. And we all, it's such a supportive, welcoming, helping community.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm trying to do, is show that there are other British people out here, and the Aftermath Foundation will help you wherever you are in the world. Talking about second and third generation Scientologists, children growing up in it, I wanted to talk a bit about the Wackley family, because my senior at London Org was Charlie Wackley, who was kind of famous a few years ago in the anti-Scientology world, because he put out quite a lot of promo stuff on social media promoting London Org and staff and so on. It got picked up by Aaron Smith-Levin, Tony Ortega and everyone, and he was quite a prominent public-facing Scientologist. He was my senior. And his two brothers, Jason and Matt, are still working, and so is he, still working for the church. They're third generation Scientologists. And their father, Nick, was the brother of someone that you worked with, Simon, quite closely, right?
Yeah, and Jenny and Peter, their parents were, who were Simon, Nick and Caroline's parents, were very good friends of my mother's. But they were not in the Sea Org. They had a house in East Grinstead, to my knowledge, that's still owned by the family, where students would stay. So they open house to Scientologists all the time, and they were a lovely couple. I really liked them, and my mother had her wedding reception at their house. But your friends, they weren't in the Sea Org though, were they? Were they just
Class 5 staff? Jason is now in the Sea Org. He's over in LA. Yes, he was an ethics officer at London Org when I was there, but then he joined the Sea Org. Matt and Charlie are still on staff. Charlie's now the deputy executive director of London Day. Yeah.
And I would say there's a real distinction, isn't there, between there's three factions. There's the members of the public. Then there are day and foundation staff who work at night, who are not in the Sea Org, and then there are the Sea Org members. And the Sea Org members are the most entrenched, the most indoctrinated, I'd say, the most controlled, the most robotic, probably the most scared to think and feel for themselves. And the members of the public don't see that. They don't see the abuses. The people at Celebrity Centre, people like Tom Cruise, he doesn't see how these people are treated. He doesn't see David Miscavige having someone crawling on their hands and knees, licking a toilet floor till his knees bleed. He doesn't see David Miscavige hitting people, And then if you were to tell them this was going on, they'd say, oh, it was just suppressive people talking bull. But no, they need to know the truth. And I just hope and pray that they see these stations, the SBTV stations, and they understand the abuses that their money is going to support,
Yeah. If you could say, if you knew that Charlie, Jason or Matt Wackley were watching this right now, and probably knew you or knew of you, and, they're still in Scientology, if you could say something to them right now, if you knew they were watching, what would you say?
I would say, please think about what you're doing. You're contributing to pain, to hurt, to abuses that cannot be allowed to continue, and you cannot turn a blind eye to them. There are people who are genuinely suffering and are just not allowed to be themselves. One of the biggest things I ever talked to you about in Scientology is allowing people the freedom to be. And I'm afraid that just does not happen anymore. And also, I'd like to just add that David Miscavige has changed policies and created his own policies that have nothing to do with Ron Hubbard. Who is this guy? He's just interested in making money. Yeah, as far as I can see.
And I think it's also important to note that Scientology changes people. We talked the other day about Graham Wilson, right? Yes. Graham Wilson is currently the head of OSA here in the UK. OSA being the spy wing, the PR guardians of Scientology. Not that they have much of a PR industry to protect in the first place. Yeah, there are. I always find it funny that their job is to protect the image of Scientology. Well, they don't really have much image left to protect,
No,
but
no.
they are the spy wing. They're the ones that are in charge of attacking and discrediting critics, and they are vicious people. And you know, I met Graham a handful of times when I was in Scientology, and he was quite a scary person. He's the sort of person that you don't want to mess with, you don't want to cross with. You know, he's OSA. He's, you know, don't
Yeah,
speak unless you're spoken to, and don't
no.
piss him off, do as you're told.
And
But
that really
speaking to
surprises
you,
me.
yeah,
Yeah,
this is what I was going to say. Speaking to you and several other people who knew Graham before he was in this post,
yeah.
say that this doesn't match up with who he was at all. You know, which just shows Scientology changes you, because what was Graham like when you knew him?
So I first met him in Scotland. I'd been sent to a mission in Edinburgh, to the Scientology organization in Edinburgh, and he was lovely. He was really friendly. I mean, I remember going out. There was, I think, about 4 or 5 of us in a flat watching football together, and he was great fun. He was really, you know, amenable and genial and just lovely. And I don't recognize the person that he became. I saw him on television once, probably on like a Good Morning TV station or something, defending Scientology, and he'd become somebody I just did not recognize at all. Yeah,
And that's what Scientology does. You know,
yeah.
I look back on how I was behaving and who I was talking to, and the way I was trying to sell books, or the way I was talking to people, was so different. Like I still remember to this day, like, conversations I had with my mum, for example, and I'm like, I completely blocked that out of my head, but God, I was a dick. You know, because that's where it puts you in your
It
head,
does.
is you're fighting as hard as you can to make Scientology work. KSW, keeping Scientology working, right?
It's
It
almost
makes
like
you
you've got
miserable.
a little recorder in your head and it's
Mm,
playing, and it's not your words that are coming out. It's what you've been told. It's
yeah,
exactly like a robot,
yeah,
you know?
absolutely. Should we go through a couple of those pictures that you sent me? And
Yes.
if people want to put some questions in the chat for us, we can answer some of those while we do this. But these are the pictures that that Danielle sent me. I don't know what order they're in. But let me open it up here. So this picture here is the Folo staff. So this was what we were talking about down near Brighton, Rottingdean, right?
Yeah, that's some of them. I don't know
Yeah.
who all of them are. I couldn't remember.
Are you in this one anywhere?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
No, because I was LOH Com UK. I wasn't, if you see what I mean, I wasn't part of the
Oh, right.
furlough.
Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
This is Francis Murphy.
Which one? The
Sorry, I'm using my arrow thinking everybody can see it. Okay, front left with their
yeah,
legs crossed, that's Francis Murphy.
yeah.
I'm not certain of the next one in. I think she possibly was Brad Gentry's wife.
Mm,
The CEO at the time, Ron Hopkins.
yeah.
This lady was called Maddie. I can't remember her surname, Madeleine. This was Phil Stannard.
You have an excellent memory that you're remembering all these names.
Some of them. He's passed on, sadly.
Right.
I'm not 100% sure, but I think this guy's called Tony on the far right.
Yeah.
Then going back left again. I don't know. Andrew Chalmers, maybe, not 100% sure. I'm sorry.
See, I know Andrew Chalmers. I'll have to see if I can dig up some pictures of him when he was younger and see if that's him.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Not sure. And then Tracy Springle.
Does this one
Sorry,
here,
no,
right?
don't know who that is. Tracy Springle and Celeste Oram.
These two. Wow. So if anyone watching is familiar with any of those names and knows anything about where they ended up, what they're doing now, or anything like that, do get in touch. It'd be really interesting to hear some more of those sort of stories. Then we've got this one here. This is you in Zimbabwe, right?
Yeah. Just before my mum married a Scientologist in South Africa.
So this is a real smile when you were truly happy.
Yeah, I was happy then.
Yeah.
Before Seahawk. And then I wanted to highlight this because the joy I found in living once I'd left Scientology was amazing. I went skiing, I went on holidays, you know, I went I went all over the world. I went to America, I went to Corfu, I went to Spain, I just went everywhere. South Africa again, safaris, restaurants, just finding the joy of living. And I think, you know, if I were to say to anybody in Scientology, do you really want to live in a world that's run by Scientologists or run by Sea Org, run by David Miscavige? Do you really want to for the rest of your life? Because living out here can be fantastic fun. And it is not the scary place, and it doesn't have to be the scary place that they tell you that it is. That's all part of the indoctrination.
All I'll say is when I was on staff, I was locked in a room and told that I couldn't leave until I'd written up what I'd done wrong against the church, you know, an OW write up. You know, Jason Wackley was the DIR at the time. He literally put his hand on the door and he said, "You cannot leave until you've done this." And I was crying, begging to leave. That's what happened to me when I was in Scientology. I can sure as hell guarantee that has never happened since leaving Scientology. I've never been treated like that outside of Scientology. In fact, I'm quite free to enter and leave rooms as I please outside of Scientology. What a wonderful luxury. But this is the reality, right? Of the world outside. They make you believe that you're never going to make anything in your life. You're only going to work at McDonald's flipping burgers. Firstly, nothing wrong with doing that, right? That's actually quite a good job. If you need a job and stable income,
you get paid.
You get paid more than you do at the Seal. But anyway, you know, the world isn't as scary as they make it seem. And we are all here to help you and support you.
I will just say my husband, Neville Chamberlain, was quite a well-known Scientologist back in the day. And when they declared him, they called him a very dangerous man because he has quite a lot of knowledge. And he did have quite a lot of knowledge about L. Ron Hubbard. And they locked him in a room in the manor house and told him that he couldn't come out until he'd written out all his his overts and withholds, where things that you've done towards any transgressions. And he made it all up. He just made up real stupid stuff.
That's what I did. That's all I did.
But the problem is he made up stupid things like things that might be illegal. You know, he just made it all up. And of course, they took that as truth. And that's why they've called him a very dangerous man. And then they've quoted what he wrote in there. And it's just insane.
Yeah,
insane.
I'm waiting for my hate site when they start calling me a thief and a liar, because one of the things I wrote was that I sometimes stole. Well, I didn't say someone stole. I said sometimes I'll take a can of Coke or whatever out the fridge, and we had an honor system, so you put the money in the tray. And sometimes I didn't put the right money in the tray, so therefore it's an overt because I'm technically stealing from the church. I'm waiting for them to say I'm a thief. I've admitted to stealing stuff. But you know, that's the way they operate. There's a great question here from Educo. Hi mate, this is someone I know. He's a really good guy actually. Apostate Alex, who's responsible for running the RPF in the UK, and is it still operating? As far as I'm aware, the RPF is kind of like the Guardian's office in that it was wound down and no longer exists because they were concerned about it being raided by the FBI and so on. But that doesn't and it's bad PR, but that doesn't mean it's still operating under a different name. The Guardian's office became the Office of Special Affairs. The RPF, as far as I'm aware, is called something else now, but it still happens. And yes, it is happening in the UK.
Yeah.
No, it's the way it works, unfortunately. Alrighty, so Linda, thank you for becoming a channel member. Welcome. If you want to support the channel, you can do that. You can buy me a coffee,
and you can buy a t-shirt.
Oh yes, Danielle is sporting one of my t-shirts. Not today, Thayton. I've got another one on. Cult suck. If you want to get yourself some merch, go to apostatealex.com and you can buy yourself some merch. Do you want to do a giveaway, Danielle? We can do a giveaway if you want.
Sure.
So if let's get everyone involved in the chat. If you want some merch, we'll give away a t-shirt, right? Is that what do you want to give away, Danielle? The one you're wearing or a different one?
Well, give them a choice maybe, because this is more of a feminine one, possibly. If you know, if there's a lady who prefer that one, or maybe a choice, maybe.
Okay, so how about if you want some merch, you can choose any t-shirt that's on my merch store, apostatealex.com. There's Cult Suck, there's Not Today Thayton, there's SPTV merch, there's all sorts. So if you want a t-shirt, let us know in the chat, say merch me, or whatever, just put something in the chat, doesn't matter what it is. And then Danielle and I are going to pick a random person to win a t-shirt. So just put something in the chat right now. Light the chat up. There's a few second delay sometimes. And then we'll pick someone. Do you want to count us down in a second, Danielle? Maybe from 10 and we can pick someone?
Okay. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hey, all right, Mena, congratulations. You have won a t-shirt, as you please. If you want to email me hello@apostatealex.com, I will send you a link to redeem whichever t-shirt it is that you want. Congratulations. That was unexpected. I wasn't thinking we were going to do that, but why not? Let's have fun. All right, so let's get on with the last couple here. Margaretti Nielsen wondering if there are still some Danish Scientologists. Yes, there's quite a big base in Denmark, I believe. Do you have any memories or stories from Scientology in Europe from your time?
No, not really. I had a very close friend who came from Denmark who I had to not be friends with anymore once I left, sadly, because he stayed in. And I was really sad about that because we had a really strong platonic relationship. It was a great friendship. And I found out just the other day from Amy Scobie, sadly, that he passed away about 20 years ago, and I had no idea. But he's the only person I really knew, plus a guy called Antonio Del Franco. I think he'd been at DK, even though he was Italian. But I'm afraid not. I know Mick Wenlock and his wife Nancy had been quite involved in Denmark. Yeah, I mean, if anybody wants us to find out anything, we can ask.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said, just hearing people's stories means more people reach out. And I think that's the beauty of this SPTV phenomena is you never know what information someone might have about someone that might not be up to date, but it's a piece of information that they didn't already know, like
and also, sorry, Alex, it's also where they went when in the early 80s to steal the OT materials from.
Yes, that's true. That's why we have the OT materials on the web now, because they were stolen and published online.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think with the Wackleys, for example, I was incredibly close to Charlie Wackley. He was my best mate in Scientology. Coming out of Scientology, I've learned stories about his dad that I didn't know or have any clue about when I was in Scientology. That's what I mean. Like, the more people I speak to, the more stories that come out, the more we learn about these people, and the more we build up a picture, because people aren't honest in Scientology, because you can't be honest, because you have to be always tone 40, smiling, everything's great, even if you're feeling shit on the inside. Excuse my friend. Yeah. Danielle, look, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been fantastically insightful and interesting. And is there anything that you didn't cover that you wanted to talk about before we wrap up?
I mean, I certainly think the abuse is worthy of a session all on its own, because I know I'm not alone, and I know of others. The forced abortions is something else which is utterly atrocious and appalling, and that needs to be addressed. And I'm just trying to think, is there anything else? Just really the disconnection policy and families not being able to see each other and speak to each other. It's not being human. What is being human? Human is loving, being kind. Love doesn't exist in Scientology. It doesn't. And it's very sad. I think one used to be able to form quite strong, loving relationships with people in terms of just strong friendships, but they're just cast asunder, aren't they? So
That's something I spoke to Janice and Mark about, actually, is the concept of love in Scientology. We were thinking of doing a video on just the idea of love and how it's lacking in Scientology. So you should join us for that. That would be a fantastic stream, because
absolutely love to do that.
it's such an interesting topic, because it's not really talked about in Scientology. It's all about purpose and aligning purposes and common goals.
And also, what is the joy of living? I have found such joy in art. You know, I paint, I draw. I was never given that opportunity in Scientology. And people who are creative and are musical, how much freedom are they given to be able to do that? And that's inherently them as a being, as a person. You know, oh, makes me cross.
And the evidence is there. Look at David and Sheila Gaiman, who we were talking about a second ago, who are among the most prominent UK Scientologists. Their son Neil, who's a very famous author, he's not really practicing Scientology. He's kind of distanced himself from it. So there's a creative person who's been brought up and raised in Scientology and has decided to not go down that route. And that's because he can clearly see that it stifles creativity. And
he was one of my auditors once in a sec check.
Was he really? Neil Gaiman?
Yeah.
Wow, that's a story that we should delve down for sure.
Oh my God.
Well, Danielle, thank you so much for joining me. And guys, thank you for joining in the chat. This has been fantastic. I'd love to have you back on again at some point, Danielle. And let's definitely arrange this love chat with Janice and Mark. It doesn't sound, that didn't come across in the right way, but you know what I mean. Thank you so much, guys. And we will see you on the next one.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.